Our seventh video here on the Middle Ages is going to focus a little bit more on the politics of two particular countries. So we're going to focus a little bit here on a couple of the kings of England and a couple of the kings of France. So that's what we're going here as we're moving and grooving through the Middle Ages. So we need everything in yellow. In the 800s, we talked about this. England's being continuously raided by Vikings. We talked about this. This goes all the way back to video number 2 in this series. So the Vikings are raiding across the North Sea, so much so that the Vikings decide, why are we even going back? And they begin to settle in the east of England. So they go and create a Viking kingdom in eastern England along the coast there, which makes sense geographically because it's closest to Scandinavia. Now, Alfred the Great is one of the Anglo-Saxon kings of England, and he gets his name the Great because he's so great at barely keeping the Vikings in England at bay and from taking over the rest of the country. Now, he's got a lot of other things that he does well, but again, we're kind of skimming over the top, the surface of the politics of England here. Now, that's what we have there. So we have in England, you've got in England itself, you've got Vikings in the eastern part of the country. Towards the southern coast, you've got Anglo-Saxons, you've got Welsh in the west, and then you've got Scottish in the north. So those are the kind of melting pot that you have on the island of England, and then obviously you have the Irish to the west, but they're not going to factor in too much here in this tale. We also want to remind you that the Vikings are expanding and attacking so much in the 800s that the King of France has said, here you go. Here's parts of northern France, Vikings. Take it. It's yours. You guys are the North Bend. Here's north of France, Normandy. So we have Viking descendants who are vassals to the King of France as Dukes of Normandy, which is their fief of Normandy in the north of France. So that's kind of setting the stage here of the effects that the Vikings have had socially in England as well as in the north of France. And we'll see how these now begin to develop politically. So we're going to fast forward into the year 1042. In the year 1042, the Anglo-Saxon king Edward the Confessor has returned to England from Normandy to rule. Again, please make sure you understand we're doing very skim surface level stuff here. We're not going too deep into this. But what we want to understand is that through various marriages, the King of England is Edward the Confessor, but he has also worked to now become the Duke of Normandy. So you have Edward the Confessor as the King of England, and he is also the Duke of Normandy. So that's important to understand. Now, he's Edward the Confessor because he's confessing his sins a lot, because he's going to church a lot. So if you're following the train of logic here, he doesn't have a whole lot of time to be able to have any kids. So in the crucial year, and this is one of the big years we want to remember, particularly if you want to study English history, in the year 1066, Edward the Confessor has died childless. So that now leaves two things open. One, there's no longer, we need a new Duke of Normandy, because that's what the Confessor was, and we need a new King of England. So the question's going to become, who is going to fill both those roles left by the dead English King, Edward the Confessor? So the English kings have very much, again, they're centered around here in London, so very much in the south of the country is run by the English kings. However, what we see here is the eastern part of England, because it's so close to Scandinavia, is going to be very much dominated by Viking settlements by the time we get to the 800s into the 900s. There, the Vikings are kept from taking over the rest of England because of Alfred the Great, shown in statute here. And again, the story where we want to start really telling is with Edward the Confessor here on his deathbed, doing his final confession as he's dying and leaving an empty throne of England. So the story takes off here is that three different people say that they are the true rightful kings of England. Through marriage and through other things, we have Harald Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway, who says, I am the rightful king of England. We have Harold Godwinson, the English Anglo-Saxon king, who says, I am the rightful king of England. Now, Harold Godwinson, we might want to put a little asterisk next to his name. He has the advantage in this situation because he is actually in England. So he is in England when Edward the Confessor dies, claims the throne, goes to Westminster Abbey, gets himself crowned the new King of England. The third person is William the Bastard, right? And bastard in the literal sense that his father, who's related to Edward the Confessor, had an affair with one of the people in the kitchen. They've produced William, and he, through some lucky breaks, through some murders, has worked his way up, who's become the Duke of Normandy in France, who says, I am the rightful King of England. So these three guys all lay claim to the throne, with the important caveat being that Harold Godwinson is actually in England and has been crowned the new King of England, but obviously William and Harold Hardrada see differently. So this is all happening in the year 1066. Now, as we move towards the fall of 1066, William gathers an army, moves them to the English Channel, waiting to sail, but this is a particularly stormy time of weather in there, and notoriously stormy during the fall months. So he is sitting there waiting for the skies to clear so he can launch his Normand army from Normandy in France across the English Channel to the island of England. While he's sitting there and waiting, Harold Hardrada is able to sail his Viking army across the North Sea and arrives in the northern part of England and begins to work his way south towards London. Harold Godwinson hears this, moves his army north, and Harold Hardrada, with his Viking army, and Harold Godwinson, with his Anglo-Saxon army, meet in the northern part of England at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066. The important outcome of this battle is that Harold Hardrada's forces lose. Harold Hardrada retreats back to Scandinavia with his tail between the legs. He has been defeated. Harold Godwinson has defeated the first claimant through the throne. That still leaves another guy. So while Harold Hardrada is being beaten in the north, William the Bastard has sailed across the English Channel, has landed in the south of England. So Harold Godwinson has to turn around, march his army hundreds of miles south to go meet him close to the shores of southern England. So to reiterate, we have our three claimants to the throne: Harold Godwinson on the left, the Anglo-Saxon King of England; Harold Hardrada, the Viking King of Norway; and William the Bastard, the Duke of Normandy. Harold Godwinson and Harold Hardrada fight first. They meet at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, fought in and around this bridge. It's a pretty famous conflict, lots of fighting, and we see ramifications from this today. If you know the English Premier League team Chelsea, they play in London in the stadium called, drumroll, Stamford Bridge, which is named after this. So again, setting the scene, Harold Hardrada has landed his army in the north. Harold Godwinson has marched his army 210 miles in 5 days to go meet them at Stamford Bridge. The Vikings are defeated. They go and retreat back home. But it's at this point that William the Bastard has landed in the south of England. Harold Godwinson has to turn around, march back to London, back to the south of England to go meet Harold William's army on the battlefield. These two armies clash on October 14th, 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. Now, for most of this day, it's a very back and forth battle, very much a coin flip as we begin to work towards the late afternoon about who's going to win. It's very closely fought. When, towards the end of the battle, Harold Godwinson looks up, and as he's looking up, he is hit directly in his eye with an arrow. Unfortunately for him, his brain happens to be behind his eyeball, so this will kill him. The Anglo-Saxon English army is upset by this. This is the final straw. They then are defeated and they lose the battle, which means and leaves William, the Duke of Normandy, as the last standing person and the person who's now going to be able to claim the crown of England. A lot of times in world history, we talk about things happening over the course of thousands of years or hundreds of years over the course of a year. Sometimes things in history change immediately, and this is one of those great immediate changes that we see in history because overnight we start to rattle off change after change that we see in England. The first off is one of the great rebrandings in all of world history, where William the Duke of Normandy rebrands himself as William the Conqueror and new King of England. With most of the English nobility lying dead on the battlefield at Stamford Bridge or at Hastings, that leaves a whole lot of land now that William the Conqueror has taken over and can give out to meet his political and military desires. So he divides a lot of this land that he's taken from the dead English and give it to his Norman lords. And to get the English church on his side, he gave a quarter of that land back to the church, which is a pretty sizable donation, which is going to give a sizable amount of wealth to the church, which is going to very much tie that English church to the political whims of William the Conqueror. This battle and this Norman conquest of England is gigantic for the future of England, because if England would have continued on its course without the Norman conquest, it very much would have changed its gaze towards the continent and would have looked east across the North Sea towards Scandinavia and westward towards Iceland, towards Greenland that way. With the Norman conquest, England now reorients itself back to the continent of Europe. And so England is now going to be firmly bound to the trials and tribulations of continental Europe, which is going to have huge implications all the way up to the current day. Whereas without this, the trajectory of England would very much have been just more towards that Scandinavian area of Europe. We see many other cultural changes over time as the Normans bring with them castle building, their love of hunting, which stays in the nobility, as well as changes in language, because what we see here is a French-speaking Norman nobility ruling over an English-speaking Anglo-Saxon peasantry. And the impacts of this are felt in our language all the way up to the present day. And you can particularly see it in terms of cooking, where you have a lot of ingredients which would have been used and talked about in the kitchens by the Anglo-Saxon peasants being words that are English origin words, whereas the prepared dishes that have been given to the Norman lords are words that are French, because that's what the French would have called them. So a cow is an English word, right? It's of an English origin, but when you slaughter that cow and you serve its meat, you're serving beef, which is a French word. Chicken is a English word when you're doing that, but when you slaughter that, you serve you serve poultry, which is a French word. So we see other things like that that kind of show the importance of this conquest on the development of England. One of the primary sources we have for this telling of this tale comes from what's called the Bayeux Tapestry. And this is a tapestry that is embroidered and woven by the Norman lords' wives, particularly the northern Norman French town of Bayeux, where they go and they chronicle this in a, I forget, 30, 50, 60 foot long tapestry that kind of tells this tale. Here you see the Anglo-French and the Anglo-Saxons and the French fighting there. How do we know Harold Godwinson got struck in the eye? Well, it's woven and stitched into the tapestry itself. Now, the other thing that we want to mention is, which is important, is this very much creates a impossible feudal situation where you have a Norman lord who has the lands in France as a fief to the King of France, who is also the King of France's equal as the King of England. So this is very much an untenable feudal situation of how can a King of England be an equal to the King of France while also holding lands in France that he got as a result of a fief granted to him by the king of uh, France. So this is going to create a whole lot of problems. It's going to lead to an entire other lecture in and of itself when we get to the Hundred Years' War. Moving right along, the next major king we want to talk about is Henry II. He is going to make the smartest move of his entire life of marrying the newly single Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152. She has been married to the King of France. She supposedly might have had an affair on the Second Crusade with the King of France's uncle. It gets a little convoluted. He wasn't exactly treating her nice, so she gets a divorce. With Henry then marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine, he is now granted the rights and access to her lands of Aquitaine in the west of France, and with Henry's land holdings as the Duke of Normandy in the north of France and Eleanor's land holdings in the west of France, this creates a giant empire of not only lands that Henry owns in England, but also in France. This creates the Angevin Empire, which only adds more fuel to the fire of how can the King of England be a king yet still also remain a vassal to the French king. Importantly for our quiz, what we want to focus on with Henry is that he is great because of his concern for the administration of justice. So he does a lot to be able to set up the legal system of England, which is going to have huge implications because when English settlers leave England and come to the United States, they're going to bring this system of justice that dates all the way back to Henry with them. So how does he do this? One, he sends out royal judges throughout all of England to act as an extension of the king's power. They have the power to collect taxes, settle lawsuits, punish crimes. He introduced the use of juries. So it's not just one person who's judge, jury, and executioner. You have a idea that you are going to be put before a jury. The jury decides what the outcome of the trial is, not just the judge. And so he introduces this idea. And the idea of English common law, the common law of England that everybody kind of falls under, is going to be popularized. And that's important because English common law will become very much the laws of most of the English colonies in England, which will become most of the laws for the United States federal government as well as the different state governments. That's Henry II there on the left. And importantly, here on the right, what we see here is these orange colors begin to define the land holdings of the English king's holdings in France versus this bluey, purpley color of what the King of France owns. And what we begin to see with Henry II is that the King of England is actually going to own more land in modern day France than what the King of France owns, which again is leading to a very complicated feudal situation. Henry II has three sons. He's got his oldest son Geoffrey, his middle son Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart, and his youngest son John. Richard the Lionheart lucks out and has Geoffrey die, and so he is able to get and succeed Henry II. Richard Lionheart dies off doing that, so the crown goes to his youngest brother, King John, who's going to get the term Lackland, King John Lackland, because he lacks land, and he is arguably England's worst king. We talked about Henry II creating this big, huge, giant empire in France. It's then promptly lost by his youngest son, John, who loses a lot of these English possessions in France. We're skipping over a lot of the major beats of his reign, but he's going to get himself excommunicated by the Pope for nearly 7 years. He's going to get England put under the interdict for part of this time period. It's not a whole lot of great things that's happening for England under John. He's going to make such a continuous series of mistakes that the English barons and the English nobility, who are so upset by his losses in France, decide to round him up, rebel against him, and capture him after the Battle of Bouvines. And shortly after, the English barons draw up a document and force King John to draw up that document, which then is called the Magna Carta. Magna Carta is Latin for Great Charter. Now, importantly, what this document is going to do is very much in 1215, the Magna Carta is really just between the 180, 200 barons of England and King John. This is just really a document that deals with a lot of feudal rights and obligations. So, in the immediate aftermath of this signing, really there's only a couple hundred people that are affected by this document. However, over time, as other things happen through English history, particularly as we move into the 1640s with the English Civil War, and we again see the English nobility and the English people having problems with the king, in the 1640s, people begin to look back into history to look for precedents, to look for other examples of the king's power being lessened, and then the Magna Carta takes on a whole new interpretation. Now, why this document is important is because the Magna Carta represents a check on the King of England's power. This is really the first time that we see any sort of checks and balances in their kind of most rudimentary and elementary form throughout all of Europe. And what we see here, which makes the English kings different, is the English kings don't have carte blanche power like we see other kings of England or other kings of Europe have. So the king is required to have parliament convened every year. The king cannot just tax people without going through parliament. Parliament has what's called the power of the purse in England, where they can raise taxes. They have to do stuff. Now, for a lot of time in English history, parliament is just rubber stamping the king saying. However, several instances, they do not rubber stamp what the king wants, and that represents a major turn of events. The other thing the Magna Carta does is it guarantees certain political rights that people of England have, again, more towards the upper class of England. But again, this becomes written down and becomes an example for other laws to be built on top of this and use this as a precedent. So that's why this is such a big deal. So what we see here, you got King John's effigy that's in Westminster Abbey. In the center, he's being forced, and you can see the sneer to sign the Magna Carta. And this is the document that he's going to sign. You can go see this in person in a couple different places. You can travel all the way to Washington, D.C. In the National Archives and see a copy of the Magna Carta there. You can also go all the way to London and go to the British National Library and see a copy of it there as well. So there's still some of these Magna Cartas, the original documents that have been hand copied, still floating around today. So we're going to switch gears from the kings of England to the kings of France. So what we see here in the year 987 is the king of France running the Capetian dynasty. So we've moved from the Merovingians to the Capetians. In 987, the French king only really controls a small territory in and around Paris, the Ile-de-France. So he's really just that territory is what the King of France controls as the Kingdom of France. Hugh Capet is going to take over in 987, and he's going to begin the Capetian dynasty, which is going to set up kind of the next major family that's going to rule France for the next couple hundred years. Skipping ahead, the next major important Capetian ruler is Philip II or Philip Augustus. Again, why does he change that name? Well, he's trying to build upon the legacy of the first emperor of Rome, Augustus. So it kind of goes and should give you a clue of how powerful and how influential he is. So Philip II increases the French kings of power in a couple different ways. First, he seizes land in Normandy, Brittany, and Anjou from the King John of England. If King John of England is losing land in France to the King of France, who's that King of France? It's Philip Augustus. It's Philip Augustus who seized land in the south of France on the Albigensian Crusade. We talked about this in the last lecture towards the end. Who's the big winner in the Albigensian Crusade? It's the King of France. Who is that King of France? It's Philip Augustus. So he's seizing land in the north from the King of England. He's seizing land in the south from the Albigensians. Similarly, like Henry II of England, Philip II also is concerned for the administration of justice, and he's going to establish royal courts where he sends out not judges like England, but bailiffs to go out and, just like Henry II, collect taxes, hear court cases, see that justice is done, and kind of have them act as an extension of his royal power. So here we see the coronation of Philip Augustus draped in again the purple and the fleur-de-lis of the kings of France. And we can see over the course of his reign, the red of England and the purple of France begin to change, where the English are being kicked towards the southwest, and the King of France begins to assert more of his dominance throughout the kingdom of France. The last major king we want to talk about today is Philip IV. And in 1302, Philip IV, or Philip the Fair, gets involved with a quarrel with the Pope. Basically, that, again, we've talked about this in a couple different ways, that the clergy, the people in the Catholic Church, are making a lot of money in a lot of different ways. And the king says, I should be able to tax you because you're making money off of my subjects. So the question really boils down to that he gets in the Pope is, can the French king tax the Pope? And the bigger, more consequential issue is, whose authority is superior in a kingdom? Is it the king having the ultimate authority or the Pope having the ultimate authority? Again, this goes all the way back to who crowned Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor. It was the Pope that did it. So there's a lot of interesting politics that are going at play here. So Philip, to try to be able to get more political power in France on his side, is going to establish what's called the Estates Generales, which is going to be a council of church leaders in the first estate, a council of lords in the second estate, and commoners is maybe not the best way to say it, but more upper class non-nobles in the third estate to help support his decision. Now, importantly, unlike Parliament, which is going to have the legal backing of the Magna Carta, the Estates Generales is really never going to have much political or legal influence in France like we see Parliament have in England, which is going to be another reason why we'll see a split in how England goes off in its political development versus how France goes off. The quarrel with this pope is going to culminate in September of 1303 when Philip IV sends his French goons to Rome. They knock on the pope's door. The pope answers, says, "Who is it?" They put a bag over his head and they kidnap him and send him to France. And from 1309 to 1337, the popes of the Catholic Church are going to rule from Avignon in southern France rather than in Rome, so that the King of France can keep an eye on these popes to make him do what he wants. This is going to cause people to be upset about this and say, we're not going to listen to this pope because he's obviously under the thumb and under the control of the King of France. So we're going to elect our own pope. So you'll have a pope in Rome, you'll have a pope in Avignon. They're going to be poping against each other. It's a major disaster and not a whole lot of clarity that comes out from this time period from the Catholic Church. This is referred to as the Babylonian captivity. As we saw, we've heard another term for the Babylonian captivity heard before, but eventually in 1337, the popes will leave Avignon and return back to Rome. So that's where we'll stop for today. We got a portrait here of Philip IV. We're going to continue talking about the Middle Ages, and we're going to move into an extension of this feudal dispute that we saw kind of bubble up here, of what happens when the King of France and the King of England want to possibly join together under one guy, or how they go apart, or how do we solve this feudal problem of the King of England also having lands in France that he got from the King of France. And that's an issue that we'll see in our next lecture.